Right. Good morning. I see participants entering. We're going to give it a moment because it takes just a few seconds to get people into the session. Thank you for joining us, everyone. All right. Welcome, everyone, to our first Crane Policy Chat. This is a new series hosted by the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy. In these chats, we plan to discuss current policy issues affecting early childhood with an expert guest and an engaged audience. My name is Jamie O'Leary. I'm the Associate Director of Policy and External Affairs at Crane. I'll be hosting our chat today. The format is going to be more of a live discussion, kind of like what you see, or I guess hear in podcasts. And we will have poll questions and are hoping for a lot of audience engagement from you all. Welcome to our audience members. Please tell us your name and where you're from in the chat box. My colleague Kathy is monitoring the chat box. She'll be adding housekeeping items there and other resources. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our guest, Dr. Shoshanah Inwood. Dr. Inwood is an associate professor of rural sociology in Ohio State School of Environment and Natural Resources. Her career has focused on the intersection of agriculture, environment, and society in the context of community and economic development. As many of you already know, a key contributor to community and economic development includes quality and reliable childcare for families. Over the last decade, Dr. Inwood and her colleague have interviewed and surveyed thousands of farmers across the U.S. to understand how childcare affects the economic viability of their farms, farm safety, their quality of life, and even the future of the nation's food supply. This work has led to findings that she has been able to share through peer-reviewed studies, news outlets, congressional briefings, and Kathy's going to drop a few of those in there if you'd like to preview them. Welcome, Dr. Inwood.
Thank you so much for having me, Jamie, and thank you to everybody for taking time out of your very busy schedules to be here today.
Great. So, Dr. Inwood, my first question, you've been a farmer and an associate professor and researcher. Which of these jobs was harder?
Jamie, I'll be honest, and the hardest job has actually been being a mother and a working mom. I'm sure many of the folks that are on the call today will know being a working parent is stressful. And even if you're a stay-at-home parent, that can also be stressful as well.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Where did you farm and what did you farm?
Yeah, so I actually, after I graduated college, I had intended to go into the Peace Corps and interned at a farm in Richland County, and then decided that I really wanted to stay into farming. And a friend and I, we started our own 5-acre organic vegetable farm in Lucas, Ohio, which is in Richland County. And then we sold everything down in Columbus at the North Market and at the, and in Clintonville, we had a CSA, and this was the dawn of the millennium back in 2000. And really wanted to keep farming, but then really realized how hard it was to make a living in farming. And neither one of us had either any family or really community in the area. And without those community supports, it's really hard to stay in a community. And when I got to graduate school, I really tried to focus on the realities of what it's like to make a living off the land in rural America.
Yeah, absolutely. I forgot about that. My family's from Richland County, right there by Lucas. So that is very close to home. And how long have you been at OSU?
So I actually did my graduate work, both my master's and PhD at OSU, and then was at University of Vermont for a while and then state government. So, but I've been back at OSU for 6 years now, and I'm actually based up in Worcester at Ohio State's Agricultural Research and Development Station. And I've got both research and extension appointment up here.
Awesome. Fantastic. Welcome if you're just now joining us. We are chatting with Dr. Shoshanah Inwood, and I think it's time now for our first set of poll questions. We want to hear from you. Kathy, if you could launch those. And there are 3 questions here. After everyone has completed or we get a response rate, we'll show the results. And it'll just be a moment. We'll pause here while people respond. Thank you, everyone, weighing in in the chat. Tell us who you are and where you're from. This is great. You can use the chat box throughout our session. I will ask if you have particular questions that come up. It's much easier if we use the Q&A box because it will house all the questions there. So definitely feel free to start using that at any point throughout the discussion today. And it looks like we have good responses here. Kathy, is this a high enough response rate? We can share them?
Yeah, we've had almost just about everyone weigh in. So I'll go ahead and end the poll. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. So are these sharing? Okay, perfect. All right. How many farms are in America? The predominant response here is 1.3 million. Shoshanah, what's the right answer?
2 million. Which is actually less than 1%, less than 2% of the American population. Sorry.
Wow, that is definitely high. I remember reading that thinking that was higher than I would have guessed.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What percentage of farm families report difficulty securing childcare? Let's see what people thought. Most people said 77%, and then in descending order.
Yep. So, and in our research, we found that of the farmers that we surveyed, 77% said that they had trouble securing childcare.
Yes, very challenging issue. Good job, audience, on that one. Most folks got it. And no right or wrong answers on number 3. Have you ever been to a farm? This is interesting. Okay, this surprises me. Most people have.
Great.
All right. I feel like I've been to farms with my kids with like petting animals and stuff, but I don't know in terms of like a working farm or some of the farms you've surveyed, if I've been to any of those.
Those are working farms too, because they've got agritourism and that's part of their business model probably.
Yes, that's true. Very good point. Okay, so the poll is closed. Dr. Inwood, childcare and farming are 2 things you typically don't hear about together in the same sentence. Tell us why childcare is a farming issue.
Yeah, so one of the things that we saw, right, in just in the poll, right, is that there's only 2 million farmers in the country, which again is less than 2% of the American farm population. And one of the things that we've been seeing also is the average age of farmers has been going up in America. The average age is actually 58.9. So we actually have a very shrinking, we have an issue of a shrinking and an aging workforce within agriculture. And when you look at the family structure of farmers, what you see is actually that 98% of all American farms are family farms. And farms that are and families have children and parents and and nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles and grandmas and grandpas. And so within that, there's inherently going to be a need for childcare of some form or another. And so, one of the things that we also know is that, farms can be really wonderful places to grow up on. A lot of really great benefits for living and working on a farm. And in fact, in our research, over 3 and 4 farm families said that they love having their kids working with them when they're on the farm. But the reality is also that farms are very dangerous places. And from the National Farm Medicine Center, we know that every 3 days, a child dies on the farm. And what's also really different about farms compared to other occupations is that oftentimes you are working and living in very close proximity to that space. And in farming, you're using a lot of very large equipment. And that can also have a lot of pesticides, herbicides. You can be dealing with large spaces. And so it's really hard to keep an eye on children all the time when you're also trying to be doing your work. And just within our larger culture, we don't often think and realize that farm parents are also working parents. And so there's a real need to start to address some of the issues and challenges that they're facing that are very much akin to what other Americans are facing, but can be exacerbated because of that dangerous working environment.
So farming with children is not sort of the idyllic picture we probably see on Instagram. I think I probably follow some of those accounts. It looks quite lovely, but
yeah, and I think that's a really great point, Jamie, that, you know, a lot of times we go to the grocery store, we flip through magazine ads and we see these beautiful pictures of families smiling and in fields. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I want that life, you know? and a lot of this research that we've been doing over the last 10 years is really showing that that's a part of the story, but the fact that the people who think that that's a whole story, that's a myth, right? There's actually a lot more that's happening behind those glossy photos.
yeah. So let's dive into that. Tell us about how and when you realized childcare was a key part of farming sustainability and success. I know you and Dr. Bicott have spoken with thousands of families throughout your research. Tell us about the project.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, this is very much a personal research project for me as well. And I think for many folks who do research, right, like our own lives inspire our research. And when I had left farming and transitioned into academia, I started going through my life course and having young children and, you know, new assistant professor, struggling with my own childcare issues and talking to my friends that were still farming because we were all in that same life phase. And they started sharing that, well, they were having really big challenges with childcare and also accessing health insurance at the same time. And this was really interesting because my research is about community and economic development through food and agriculture. I was like, you know, why isn't anybody really talking about this? So, right, in research, what do? We go into the literature and looked, you know, what's the literature say? And only found 2 articles looking at childcare and farm families. And one article was from the 90s. It was kind of about farm safety and the need for more off-farm childcare. And the other one was from actually the 1980s. There was a report that USDA had commissioned with interviewing farm women. And one of the things that they asked for was more childcare so that they could further their own agricultural careers. And this was a report in the gray literature. And so what we know is that since the 80s, right, this has been an issue and really even before. But, you know, then there we were in the 2000s, the early 2000s, right? And in research, knew what we really needed to do is say, well, is this really a problem? Right. And is it still a problem? And what way is it a problem? Because the economy's changed. We're in a new millennium. Lots of things have changed since we've been having these benchmarks in the 1980s. So first did a really small pilot study to actually ask, is this a problem? And I do both qualitative and quantitative methods. And when we had a national survey of farmers who are farming at the rural urban interface, so places where there's a lot of development pressure, we asked them, you know, is this a problem for farmers who had kids under 18? 3/4 of them said, yes, this is a problem with both affordability, quality, and accessibility, getting access to childcare. And then at the same time, I was in a new position at University of Vermont and had access to dollars and had a graduate student. And we set out to do focus groups with farmers across the Northeast to understand the qualitative ways in which this was impacting their farms and their quality of life. And so we were really able to start diving into this in a lot more detail and really seeing how this was affecting both their economic development and quality of life. And then with Dr. Bicott, who is my grad student and now at the National Farm Medicine Center, we were able to expand this to also look at farm safety issues. Right. So we've been doing this both qualitatively and quantitatively as well.
Nice. What have been some of your most important findings, and did any of the findings surprise you?
So I think the fact that so many folks have been willing to say that this is an issue, right? The fact that this actually is an issue and kind of really pushes against that myth of what the idyllic family farm is. And that this is a problem not just for women in agriculture, but also men. about both men and women are saying that childcare is a problem. And it's a problem for both multi-generation farmers and especially for first-generation farmers. And those are folks who don't have, access to the land through a family, and also probably don't have as many community connections. And so some of the things that we saw is that folks are moving to a farm for good soil, but then don't have any community and support for their children. And in some cases, that is leading to folks leaving agriculture. It's leading to divorce. It's leading to a lot of social disorganization and stress. And those are things that USDA really hasn't been thinking about when they're trying to build up the next generation of farmers, right? And who's going to feed us? This is really a national security issue, where USDA is investing a lot of money into building up markets and land access and capital and credit, but not addressing these household and social issues.
Yeah.
I think one of the other myths that we've been able to see that's been busted is that, especially among multi-generational farms, like there is family and friends nearby. But then half of the farmers that we've been surveying nationally said that 42% said that their family and friends are too busy to help. Right. And 1/4 said that they can't help, their family and friends can't help because of health difficulties. So again, I think, right, that there's also this idea that there's multiple grandparents on the farm. And the real reality is that the American economy has changed, where individuals are working later into life, right? So they're not as available to help out with watching younger children. And also in some cases, they may not want to be helping out, right? Watching those kids. And so those realities really converge into busting some of those myths.
Yeah.
I think
That's
one of the other, just one other really quick thing that I think was really surprising was there's been a lot of conversation around mental health in the news and farmer mental health. And when we did our focus groups, there was somebody in at least every focus groups who talked about, with women who talked about postpartum depression. And when we did our survey, we found that 46% of the sample had either themselves or somebody in their family was suffering from postpartum depression. And that is a topic that is not discussed at all, that we know can make caring for children even more difficult when you're dealing with those mental health challenges.
Wow, that is very high. That is fascinating. And I can imagine your work as a sociologist, like uncovering some of those trends that, like you said, USDA hasn't thought about or studied, and there's so much context there.
Yeah. And I think maybe one of the other things that was just really surprising was, this research has been going on before COVID. And when we were gearing up to do our latest project that's been funded by CDC around farm safety, we didn't know that COVID was coming. And we were doing our focus groups in 2021 was our plan. And we wound up doing those online. And when we set out to recruit, we were hoping for 36 women in the 3 states of Ohio, Wisconsin, and Vermont. And we gave ourselves 5 weeks to recruit. In 5 days, we had 108 women sign up for registration, and we had to shut it down and do 13 focus groups with these women. People really wanted to talk and share their experiences. And then from that, a subset of 40 of those women participated in a photo voice project, and so shared over 320 photos with us of what their lives are really like raising children on the farm.
Wow. Is anyone else studying this?
Well, so what's really interesting is that folks have been looking at childcare and farm workers. I would say that there's actually been a lot more research, and there's actually a lot more policy support for farm workers, and there really has not been any attention to this in the farm sector. And I think part of that is, especially from agricultural economics, really kind of the conventional approach has been to separate the farm business from the farm family, right? But if you have, farm family, right, we know that those entities intersect. And there needs to be more acknowledgement of that. And there's a really rich tradition within rural studies that shows the way in which the household helps to subsidize the farm through unpaid labor. And also they'll reduce their consumption when there's an economic downturn. But there really has not been as much research that looks at how does availability of childcare, right, affect the economic development and quality of life of the farm, which is where we're really trying to center this work.
Great. I think it is time for our next poll question here. Kathy, if you could help us launch that. Thanks to everyone's active engagement in the chat box, and I'm going to hop over to the Q&A and see how that's going. How many rural communities are childcare deserts? All right. Good response rate. We'll give it 10 more seconds. And then Kathy, if you could share results. All right. Are those being shown? I can't tell from my view here.
Yep.
Okay. Most respondents said 4 and 5 are childcare deserts. Most folks did not think it was as low as 1 and 5 or 2 and 5. Shoshanah, what's the right answer?
So it's actually 3 and 5 before COVID. I don't know what the number is right now, but before COVID, it was 3 and 5.
Wow,
Rural
okay.
community with childcare deserts.
So it might be more like 4 and 5 now.
Yeah.
Wow. All right, I'm going to hop over to the Q&A. There was a couple questions here I wanted to get to before we go back to our conversation and the question list we have. So Mark Gooch wanted to know, do you have a sense of whether childcare issues contribute to the lower number of young people going into farming?
Oh, absolutely. I think that that is definitely, Mark, a really great insight. I was really surprised when we were doing focus groups and inviting farmers to come in, especially like for our first stage of research on childcare. And there were folks that were coming who did not have children. And in fact, that's actually been an issue with a lot of our researchers. Folks are coming in saying, well, we're trying to figure out which state has the most progressive childcare and also health insurance as we're trying to look for land. So it wasn't just like the quality of soil, right, that was driving these decisions or proximity to markets, but people are really thinking about how am I going to do this all? We also talked to folks who said that they have intentionally not had children because they know that they can't do it all and they know that that's just too hard. And so especially, you know, again, as folks are working their way up the agricultural ladder, because we have fewer and fewer farm families and we're needing people to come in who don't have experience in agriculture. Well, when does that happen, right? Like a lot of times, like you maybe graduate high school or college and then you apprentice and then you're trying to figure out how do I get enough money to buy land because land is super expensive and farming is very capital intensive. And while you're trying to figure that out, you're usually 18 to 35. Well, you're also in your prime reproductive years. Right. And so people are having to make really hard choices about what they're going to do. And then even within the household, right, if somebody has to step back and take care of kids or get an off-farm job for health insurance and to support the family, that can lead to a lot of family tension that there's really right now no tools to help families work through and directly confront.
Right. Wow. Another question here, Elizabeth Hampton. Thank you for that question, Mark, and everyone in the Q&A box. Have you found any areas where farm families have begun childcare cooperatives?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that there are folks who are doing this on a very small scale, you know, figuring out, you know, trading and cooperatives with neighbors. There's also a number of examples of where community foundations have come in and actually helped to fund rural childcare centers like in Nebraska, really recognizing that this is a workforce attraction and retention issue. There's a great example of a farmer, he's a friend who I've met recently, and we've become good friends, Adam Olson. He's a corn and soybean farmer in Indiana, and he saw that this is one of the biggest issues in his community, and he and his wife started a nonprofit to address rural childcare in their community for farmers and the broader rural community, and they just opened their first childcare center to really address this issue, and that's just for young early childhood. And will they tell you it's enough? And if you ask, is this enough? And they'll say, absolutely not. We need more resources, and also for older children, because it's not just that preschool to or infant to pre-kindergarten phase. It's what happens, you know, when the kids are in half-day kindergarten or kindergarten and then up through elementary and middle and high school. Childcare still happens at those ages as well, and especially in the summertime, right? And that's a really big gap that we have, is what happens in the summer for camps, and we know rural areas have fewer camps than urban areas. I live in a rural community, and the summers are just horrible, right? It's really trying to juggle those things.
Yeah.
And after age 12, kids age out of a lot of the supports, right? Like for flexible spending accounts and other types of supports. But that doesn't mean that we know from an educational standpoint, and I'm sure at the Crane Center, you have a lot more data than I can ever speak to, right? About like how important it still is for that, because your kids are still kids and developing at that phase of life as well. And still
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Thinking of childcare as obviously the 0 to 5 space, but before school care, after school care, summer care, the random days off and long holidays. I know Columbus has like Wednesday professional development days. They had one yesterday. Always the number of days off that working parents have to then
and
try to find coverage for.
And if I could just add one additional thing that we don't often think about is how important school is as a form of childcare. So in our survey, the most recent one, this is from 2023, so hot off the press, when folks who were not using, who were not themselves looking after children, right, we were using family and friends and childcare providers, 62% of the sample was using school. And when we're talking about rural development, it's also really important to thinking about what are the quality of our rural schools and those before school and after school programs, because that entire time is a really important form of childcare. And we had farmers who said, you know, once the kids are on the bus, things are a lot easier. I can work. I'm not worried about them being in danger, getting hurt on the farm. I know that they're safe in school. And likewise, when kids were really young and farm parents were talking about the future, they said, well, once the kids are in school, it'll be a lot easier, right? Because that's another form of guaranteed childcare that they could afford.
Absolutely. So given that we know so much of rural America faces shortages of childcare, as our poll showed, 3 in 5, if not maybe closer to 4 in 5 now post-COVID, what sort of solutions should communities be looking towards? And I guess policymakers, what should we be doing to provide more access in rural communities?
Well, I think, you know, really having these conversations within the economic development community and you know, the early childhood, seeing more of these cross-fertilization, like what we're doing today, right, is really important to just making these invisible issues visible, right? I think, first of all, we just have to acknowledge that these are an issue. And, you know, Jamie, when you were asking me earlier, like about how this study started, one of the things that was fascinating when I started doing this work over 10 years ago is when I would ask farm technical assistance providers, right? Like, is this an issue? Like, are your farmers dealing with childcare issues? They would say, what are you talking about? My farmers don't have any of those issues. They never bring it up. We don't deal with a household, right? So there's this huge, you know, like shifting the paradigm to just even acknowledge that this is an issue. And then when we're talking about large policy decisions, right, about childcare, thinking about how is that going to affect both rural America and then also farmers. So for example, if we're talking about center-based care, that's great, right? But a lot of center-based care is designed for Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 jobs. And in rural communities and farmings, a lot of like manufacturing is happening. So they need 24-hour care just like hospitals do, right? And as well as farmers who are farming on the weekends, right? And into the evening hours as well. And we had a lot of farmers, right, talking about, who were direct marketing, talking about the struggle of trying to find childcare when they had Saturday morning markets and actually pulling out of markets and really trying to downsize their operations because they just couldn't find childcare. So I think, yeah, I'm sorry.
No, I just said, right. There's a question in our chat that's, or in the Q&A box that is related to this. Elizabeth or Erin Tebben asks, have you been able to capture the perspective of kinship caregivers too? Those who are primary caregivers for relatives' children, or I guess other networks then that could capture those non-traditional hours better than center-based care.
Right. And I think this gets into the policy question. And one of the things that we know is that, especially in rural areas, in-home based care is a really great option because the numbers to have a center-based care just are not there, right? And then you get into the variability of hours. And I think one of the things that we can talk about is how do we really increase the supply of those in-home based care, but also the quality of that in-home based care. You know, again, doing this research, we talked to folks who were not sending their children. There wasn't sometimes childcare in these rural communities, but they said the quality is so bad, I will not send my child there, right? So quality becomes just as important as quantity. And then talk to other farmers who were sending their children to an in-home daycare provider, but really disagreed and didn't like the quality, but had no other options. And so had to keep sending their kid there. And then also felt that they could not report that care provider to authorities because they knew that then all the other parents would lose access to that care. Right. So that's where, how do we, dovetail both of those things? And I think there's some really great benefits that we have, especially like at Ohio State University, we're a land grant university with extension, right? And extension has a lot of experience delivering professional development to rural, remote communities, right? So how can we be using some of that infrastructure that's already been created with the folks who have been developing the professional development, like folks that are affiliated with the Crane Center, to say, how do we merge forces to really better address this issue? So I think it's big P policy and little p policy, right? That policy and programming.
Those are great ideas. We'll have to get together and brainstorm more about the extension piece and the training piece. I love that. So you touched on this a little bit. I'm going to come back to it. There was a news article recently in Ohio. I know we chatted about this. It was about Allen County. And in it, there were some quotes and some discussion that there were too many hoops to jump through for in-home care providers, and that parents aren't thinking about the star rating. And for our audience, the star rating is just the 1 to 5 quality rating that Ohio has. What's your take on this, Shoshanah? What's at risk if we take this view, focusing on quantity over quality?
Yeah, I think we really risk multiple fronts. I think we risk actually like putting children in potentially dangerous situations. And I will say that we did not survey folks specifically about the star rating. So I don't know specifically what farmers think about the star rating, but again, everything that we've heard over and over again, 3/4 of farmers say that quality is a problem, right? And people really want quality. And also, I will say that farmers talked a lot about how important they saw childcare because they didn't want their kids to be isolated on the farm. They enjoy when their children went to daycare centers, they really appreciated that they were being engaged, the socialization, the education, the enrichment that they were getting that they knew that they couldn't get. Because a lot of times to keep children safe on farms, they have to be in a stroller, right, locked in, and some parents were locking their kids in tractors, right? And I think the other thing is, like, you think that the kids are outside, but a lot of times we heard how reliant farmers and farm parents were on devices, right? So the kids are watching just as much YouTube and iPads and things like that as all of the other kids are, right? So again, it's one of those other types of childcare opportunities that can really provide that great educational foundation that you all do so well. So I think, again, like stepping back, it's really important to look at the quality, but also how are we creating economic development within childcare itself? Because we have to really reckon with the fact that providers are often extremely low wages, very often don't get benefits. So that is another part where we need to see, how do we better support providers, providing more resources to them? And they are also a vital part of rural economic development and broader economic development within Ohio. So seeing this really as a system that works together.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a major piece of federal legislation. It sets forth the nation's food production policy, as well as federal assistance for farmers. It's passed about once every 5 years. So there have been 18 Farm Bills since 1930. Walk us through what is in this year's bill related to childcare. How did it come about, and why is it such a big deal?
Yeah. Thanks, Jamie. So also just to put a little bit more context on the Farm Bill and how large it is, and it really does touch everybody's lives. It's a $428 billion bill, and really is focusing on like providing fair prices to farmers and consumers, and really ensuring an adequate food supply. And how do we protect our natural resources? And so the majority of the Farm Bill actually goes to nutrition programs that we know are really, really important for early childhood. And a lot of the dollars in the Farm Bill also go to rural development. And one of the things that we've been able to do this year is really, since COVID, there's been much more of a willingness to talk about childcare, and we've been seeing conversations happening within farm groups as well. And for the very first time, there's been a marker bill introduced into the Farm Bill about childcare. Senator Brown from Ohio led this effort, and I helped work with his staffers on this. And really what the bill is doing is saying it's really an experiment. And it says, we know that people across rural America need help with childcare. They have ideas on what to do, but they need the money. And how can we help get them the money? And so there's rural development dollars that exist already for building infrastructure for childcare, and then also providing that technical assistance for professional development that we talked about earlier. So what this marker bill does is it prioritizes agriculturally important counties to have access for the funds for childcare. And the reason that we did agriculturally important counties is because it can get both farmers and farm workers. And this is a way to really, for the very first time, include childcare in the Farm Bill and really push the door into that this is a vital, important part of American agriculture, and not just our agriculture, but our food system as well. So there's also some dollars in there for evaluation, because this is an experiment, so that we could say, how do communities use this? What was successful? What does this tell us about what we need to do for future investments? And this really builds off some existing partnerships that have started between USDA and HHS and takes them to the next level. And what was really exciting about this Farm Bill is that it was introduced on the same day in both the Senate and the House side, with bipartisan support on both sides and tons of endorsements, which is very, very rare to see. And in talking to some of the farm groups, which can sometimes be on very opposing sides of the same issue, of one issue, they saw this as like the one issue that they could go hand in hand on for the Farm Bill.
Yeah, that is fantastic. A quick clarifying question here in the Q&A. Can you clarify what agriculturally important counties are?
Oh, that's a really great question. So that's like the top, those counties. So the U.S. Census of Agriculture is parallel to the U.S. Census of Population, and the Census of Ag keeps track of all of the farm statistics. It's done every 5 years, and agriculturally important counties are those with the top quartile of sales for their.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. I know you were able to testify to Congress. Tell us about that experience and how that came about.
Yeah, so I will say that doing this research has been really, really some of the hardest and most rewarding research I've done, right? Because you have people that are thanking you for doing this research that say, why doesn't anybody ever talk to us about these things? These are the most important things. We actually, I'm just going to read one quote that a farmer sent to us, actually as part of the survey, and as being part of the focus groups. She said, I can't put into words what being a part of this process did for me personally. I've been struggling more than I thought, and found the courage to talk to my doctor about the anxiety and stress I was carrying around every day. From a personal perspective, this research is incredibly needed. Thank you both. And when you hear that, you realize that you need to make sure that this research does not just sit on a library shelf and just does not live within journal articles. And how do we get this out? And I've consistently tried over the years, right, to translate research into research briefs, right, have relationships with legislators, and seeing, especially through COVID, how this issue was really bubbling up. I connected with some of my colleagues in the nonprofit sector, and also within OSU. And I was like, how do I reach the legislators, right? Because legislators also want to know positive stories. They don't just want complaints, right? And so it's like, I've got some data that might be useful for some of the decisions that are happening, especially because that was a time where a lot about social infrastructure and Build Back Better was a main conversation, and was actually eventually connected with a OSU graduate who is actually Senator Stabenow's staffer, her primary ag staffer in the Senate. And there were some hearings being organized around the rural care economy, and I was invited to come and testify, which was really like the land grant dream, right? Like we have public dollars, we do the research, and then to bring those voices back to the decision makers was really, one of the highlights, I think, of my career. And I did bring my daughter with me so that she could also see why she had been in daycare for all those years. Things that
That's awesome.
we're doing.
Wow. You touched on this a little bit when you talked about getting to know folks, staffers. For researchers on the call today, what advice do you have about engaging effectively in this process, such as getting to know the core staff and relationship building?
Yeah, I think definitely getting to know the staffers is so important, and the way that at least has been successful from my experience, and everybody has a different strategy. So it'd be great to hear about other people and their approaches. But working with my nonprofit colleagues who I've worked with for a really long time, because they do much more of the advocacy work, right? And I think in research, we walk a fine line between research and policy. And so I really do not do as much advocacy as I am. Let me show you the research base. And to get that out, the nonprofit folks really seem to know who are the staffers who are maybe just the intern that's there for just a semester or two versus the longer term staffers, and who would be interested in this topic, and which representative, whether it's at the state or the federal level, who's going to be really interested in this, and then help navigate and share introductions. And that's been a really effective way to figure out how to do that, because once we got to Michaela at the Senate, she was like, oh, well, have you shared this with the White House? And I was like, no, I don't know how to share it with the White House. And so she contacted President Biden's advisor for rural development. And so then we gave a presentation to 6 White House staffers, right? And it was able to kind of cascade from there. And so really spending time with those staffers, and I think also following up with thank you notes, and being able to share, even if you're sharing like your research articles, within the email, sharing the title and maybe what some of the highlights are, and which ones to help make it easier for them, knowing that they only really have the attention span for maybe 1 page, right, of research at a time, of a brief.
That is incredible. Were you nervous in front of the White House staff?
Yes, but then, and because it's hard because we only had 30 minutes.
That's such a incredible opportunity, such a big deal. I think that's spot on, telling researchers how to really break it down to 1 page. I think that is really hard, but really, really important, because they're not going to probably read past a page.
No, I think using storytelling, right, and moving beyond just the data points, a couple data points, but using those stories, and as much as possible, we pulled out from where their constituents are from, right? And that has been kind of the advantage of having national data, is we're able to say, I've been to your county, I've been to your state, or I have this data. Of course, we have farmers from your jurisdiction, and that means a lot.
Yeah, localizing it is important. We have a question here from Lynette Brosh about data while we're on that topic. Is there a source to find data regarding farming that is indicative of local counties, such as specific to Lorain County?
So yes, so the Census of Agriculture has data down to the county level, and you can look at that through the Census of Ag. And if you have any problems interpreting that data, because it is a little bit of a science and an art, right? How friendly USDA makes to do that. We don't have data about childcare, very localized. And one of the reasons why our data set is so unique is because the majority of farmers actually have occupations other than farming. So 52% of farmers do not say that farming is their primary occupation. So then when you look at some of those larger data sets that are publicly available, right, and you can look at occupation codes, if you're looking at farmers, you're missing a big segment of the population, because those are really like the full-time farmers. And we know the majority of American farmers are not full-time farmers. So that's where having this both primary and secondary data can be super helpful when we merge them together.
Mm-hmm.
And I will say that we do have also on our website, we did a case study, not a case study, but a profile of Ohio, to focus both on at the state level, both what the agricultural landscape looks like and what the childcare landscape looks like. So, and we compare that to all of our case study states, and then nationally, so that we can see how Ohio compares within that research brief. So that's available for anybody to download and look at.
Wow, very cool. Another question here from Anastasia Snyder. Does your work extend to rural childcare generally? And is this an area where more research is needed? Can you speak about just broader research needs in rural communities and related to childcare?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. And I really like to think of this work in a much broader rural economic development context, right? And again, because so many rural economies rely both on, well, first of all, there's a lot of small family-based businesses, right? And farmers it's really helpful to think of them as small family-based businesses, and some of them might be a little bit larger, right? But they are a family-based business. So they're going to have the same issues that any family-based business, whether you're a bookstore or a coffee shop, is going to have, right, in any community. And then again, the non-traditional hours, which we really see a lot of times in rural communities who have factory work. And what's also really important is to recognize, so the other thing I study is like how access to health insurance, right, affects economic development and quality of life. And what we see is, right, farmers, the majority of farmers are well insured through an off-farm job, and most of those are in the public sector. So health, education, government. And in rural communities, those are, right, the occupations that oftentimes have the highest wages and the best benefits. So when there's conversations like in COVID about, oh, we need to shrink budgets at the county level, at the local level, it's often the conversation is, let's get rid of the benefits, right? Let's shrink those benefit packages. Well, that's going to have repercussions across our communities, but also our farming communities and our food supply. And so that's where it's really important to start seeing these as a systems level issue, right? And the interconnections through that. And I think that actually allows us to have a wider conversation of who this is impacting rather than our very narrow slice. And then all of a sudden we're seeing, wait a minute, if we cut those benefits, who else are we hurting in our community that maybe we didn't realize?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for all the great questions. Continue adding them in here. We have time for several more. I have a question, Shoshanah. I know when we talked a while ago, you shared some insights related to like this window of opportunity. So you've been doing the research for a very long time, but the issue itself has come to prominence in the policy space and in the news, only recently to the extent that it has. Can you speak about that and sort of how researchers can think about building their work in the background, knowing, the time may not come for a while, sort of that strike when the iron is hot mentality?
Yeah, I think that this is the hardest part of doing research that one feels really passionately about, and that you see is such a big pressing social issue and is impacting real people's lives every day is the patience and the need to continuously be pushing forward and working in the background and thinking about this in small incremental parts. I shared, Jamie, with you that is exactly 10 years ago in 2013, I was at a USDA conference and that was about farm transitions. It was like 50 people, invite only. And I was there to talk about health insurance and childcare. And there was an ag economist I was sitting across from at lunch. He's from Oklahoma. And he asked what I was studying and I told him, and he literally snorted at me and literally told me that this was not an issue, right? And so
Oh my gosh.
it's like, that's one paradigm, right? And so over the years, it has been a tremendous amount. Sometimes I feel like a politician, right? Where I have to explain why is this an issue before we can even get to the research. And I've had tremendous number of papers rejected over the years. So like when I would go to the ag papers, I would get those, the ag journals, they would say, this is not an issue for farmers. And then I would go to Work and Family and they would say, well, the farm population is too small to talk about this. We're not going to publish this, right? And so it was really hard. And I really relied a lot on my my professional mentors, right? To say like, how could I be reshaping this? What is the literature I should be using it? What's the angle that I can use to refine this and how to speak to this? I think the other thing is like, we've intentionally kept things very apolitical, right? And I think remembering to do that so that you're speaking to the broadest audience as possible is really important. And, the moment that we had that was just kind of luck was really COVID, right? Where all of America experienced this national caregiving experience, right? We were all caring for somebody in some form of another. And to be honest, we know that caring tends to be very gendered, and men had to experience caregiving and working from home and with children. And so there's really been this very new experience that people had, and they can relate to this on a very personal level. And that has opened the door for the conversation, and it has snowballed in ways that we never would have imagined. I mean, with this Farm Bill, I thought, I would be on Medicaid by the time that this actually happened, but here we are. And how wonderful is it that is the only silver lining. That is one of the silver linings of COVID.
Yeah. Wow. That has to feel good. Have you shared your articles, or can we share this recording with that USDA economist? I'm kidding.
Like you
Follow up 10 years later. Hey.
Yeah.
No.
So, and it is. It's just, and I think it's hard, right? Because this is not a safe career choice. Like I'm not career path, right? And at the same time, right, I had a lot of struggles, and I had a mentor that said to me, you know what, keep going forward, and when they're ready, you will have all the data. And that meant that I also had to pay attention to and do other research studies and write other papers that were not as, out there, right? And I think that's the thing to also remember. In academia, we're kind of on the diffusion of innovation curve. If you look at that, a diffusion of innovation curve, and you have the innovators and the early adopters, and you have the early majority and late majority, and then they have the laggards, very pejorative term. But a lot of times we're doing like the innovative early adopter adopter, right, kind of work. And you could think about this, and you're like 15 years ago, farm to school, for example, and getting like fruits and vegetables in schools was kind of like this idea that was way out there and was very controversial. And now it's a very mainstream idea, right, because it's moved into the early and late majority. And that's where some of our ideas in the university are starting at that innovator stage. And we have to just be patient and kind of see that as a structural component to the work we do.
Yeah. All right, we have about 10 minutes left. I'm gonna keep taking questions from our box and throwing in others. And then I wanna be sure to save time at the end to hear from you, Dr. Inwood, about what you have on your plate now and sort of upcoming research. We have a question from Mark Gooch again. Thank you, Mark, for these great questions. Can you talk about how childcare for farm workers might differ from that for the actual farmers?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think it also depends which population of farm workers we're talking about, and if they're migrant farm workers versus like they're, you know, residential and not migrant, right? And I think it's oftentimes, you know, thinking about what their needs are, and if English is a second language for these children. The other part I think that actually is maybe also really helpful is to think about what are the similarities, right, between the needs. And I think that, you know, we know that rural schools tend to be underfunded with fewer resources, right? So how do we strengthen those schools so that all the different populations within those schools can benefit? And I think part of this work is not to see farm workers and farmers as different, right? But there's actually a lot of coalition building that can be done. And this work doesn't just include the farmers or the farm workers, but across the whole food supply chain, whether you're working in the fields, in the processing plants, in the distribution, in restaurants or retail. These are the jobs that pay the lowest wages and are the least likely to offer benefits. And so I think it's really a reckoning of what does it mean to have economic development and quality jobs in the food and agriculture sector, and how are these issues really very parallel and the same as what other Americans are experiencing, right? And it just plays out a little bit differently in the food and ag sector.
Right. We have a question here, taking it back a little bit to what you mentioned before regarding mental health and the very high rate of postpartum depression among women. Melba Denham asks, do you know the suicide rate of farmers? And sort of, let's maybe speak again broadly about the mental health challenges. I like how you keep reframing this as economic development issues and sort of the disconnection maybe families feel and not being able to have those social networks that we once had in our economy.
Yeah, so I also work on farmer mental health and suicide, and I don't know the rate. It is higher than the general population. I apologize for not having that. I think the thing to also always remember, right, is that suicide is the most extreme form of stress, and that there's a lot of other stress that happens and that can affect individual and family well-being and community well-being before it gets to suicide. And one of the things that we've really been able to demonstrate within our research is that childcare is one of those stressors, and it's an everyday stressor that really harps on you every single day. And when we think about agriculture, and there's a lot of conversations around climate change, right, and resilience and what's going to happen to our food supply, right, these everyday stressors are the ones that can exacerbate the more extraordinary stressors, right? So if we have workers, right, that have better health insurance and childcare systems, and they're going to be more innovative, more resilient, more healthier, right, more creative, and are going to better be able to withstand any of the shocks to the system, right? So that's really important. I think the other important place where this mental health piece and childcare intersects is how the structure of agriculture has changed a lot since World War II. And what's happened in our rural communities is as farms have gotten much smaller and much larger, there's this bifurcation of farm size, and we've lost the middle-sized farms. And what's that we've also seen is this hollowing out of our rural communities, right? So we have fewer people in those communities, we have less services, we have less resources, right? We have fewer of those kind of economic engines that happen. And that has an impact on who's going to care for the kids, right? And we had this conversation in the urban context of what's the difference of if you have a downtown that has a lot of independent, different size stores versus a community that's just dominated by a couple of big box stores like Walmart and Best Buy. The same thing actually happens in agriculture. When we lose our mid-sized farms, that drastically changes the structure of our communities. So that is another layer that adds into that social isolation, you know, and not having a community around you that can support you for all your different health needs.
Yeah.
I also just really want to quickly say, we didn't talk about this, but within our samples, what has been really wonderful as well is that we have so many different types of farm families. So we've been able to really talk to folks who have children who have special needs, whether they're, social, emotional, or physical needs, families who have adopted children, children with trauma, foster children, right? And I think that really helps expand what the story is, because it's even harder to get services into help those families, and it's exacerbated by the rural nature.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you said Senator Sherrod Brown was a leading advocate on this, and that the federal work at least has gotten bipartisan support. On a state level, are our state lawmakers aware of this? Are they thinking about this, especially the ones with rural constituents? And can you speak to, just at a state level, maybe what we can do to raise the prominence of this?
Yeah, well, I think this is actually step number one. And I think, I really look a lot to, Jamie, to your work and leadership in this space. OSU, we did have a legislative day at the House, at the Ohio House. And it was great to interact with lawmakers. I have not really interacted with many Ohio lawmakers at the state level. Here in our county, in Wayne County, they're wonderful. We have wonderful commissioners. But I think if folks have ideas about how this could be better leveraged, that would be great. I'd love to collaborate with folks on this and share research that you all might find useful.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's keep talking about that. Okay, we have time, a couple more minutes here. I'd love to hear what you're working on now, Dr. Inwood. What are you excited about? I know you've got some new grants and some more work with Photo Voice underway. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so we're really excited. So there's 320 pictures we mentioned as part of the final process of photo. Oops, we got some funding to invite those women to curate a photo exhibit based with their pictures and quotes. So we'll be working on that to launch this winter 2024. So they'll be curating both an online and in-person exhibit, and that will travel around the state. It's actually going to travel around all 3 states. And so if there's interest in maybe bringing this to a community near you, we're going to love to send these out. The other part is, one of the kind of things that's at least been very embarrassing for me personally is that I have a ton of data that says this is a problem, but very few resources to say, how can I help? And this could something that could help. And we just received some funding from USDA to develop health insurance and childcare decision-making supports for farmers and ranchers. So that is something we're going to be able to come and help, provide some tools to guide families through some of these hard questions. And then the final thing I wanted to mention that might be of use to the folks that you work with, both within research, extension, nonprofits, advocacy, is I've been working with the North Central Rural Development Center on a regional survey here in the North Central region on caregiving. And we were able to design a survey that looks at caregiving across the life course. So folks who are taking care of children, adults, and the elderly, to understand the community and economic development and health impacts to those folks. So that will be launched in February. It'll be an open access data set. So folks can just download it and run variables both at the regional level for all 12 states in the North Central region, or just for their one state. And then we just learned that the Northeast states are going to be replicating the survey, as will the South, the Rural Development Center. So for folks who also work more regionally and nationally, there'll be these same questions replicated across other parts of the United States. We're really excited for this launch.
It is great. So do you think that'll come to anywhere in Central Ohio that we could attend that exhibit when it launches? Can we stay in touch, and we'll blast out an email to participants today, letting you know if and where those appear?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that the first phase will just be kind of following the lead of where do the women want these exhibits to go, but they have said everything from their small rural village post offices to the halls of Congress to the state fair. So we will definitely, it would be great to figure out, Jamie, how we can share where we're traveling to.
Yeah, absolutely. And the online piece too. We'd love to share that out and show folks.
Right. And the one thing that would also be great for folks to keep in mind is that if you would like to host, we'll be providing guides for the types of speakers you might want to invite to be part of this. There'll be reflection questions that folks can read before they enter the exhibit. So it's not as much, it can also be a passive exhibit, but it can also be a very interactive, multifaceted exhibit that we're going to be designing.
Absolutely. A lot of great work ahead. Let me see here in the chat. We have a minute left. Do you have any thoughts on current childcare subsidy policies and the extent to which they effectively support farmers?
I think what we see is that it's just not enough right now for anybody in the United States. And I think, right, one of the things that we know and coming out of sometimes disasters is that we have the opportunity to leapfrog, right? And as we're building new coalitions and we've had this collective experience, can we take the opportunities to leapfrog at the state level and at the national level to come up with new, both, big policies and programs that can really change, Americans' lives for the better.
Absolutely. Lynette just asked where we can find the exhibit information and reach out. Lynette, I can put you in touch with Dr. Inwood and we'll share out as we get that from Dr. Inwood and be sure folks know, but definitely keep in touch. Anyone on today's call, definitely keep in touch on these. I think we're about out of time here. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Thank you to our audience for your tremendous engagement. Thank you so much, Dr. Inwood, for sharing your expertise and insights. This has been fantastic. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say thank you for everybody who's been on for all the work that you do every day and, being on the ground. As folks were going through, I really saw that there's a lot of boots on the ground folks on this call. And we thank you for really just sharing with us what your experience and insights are and how can we partner with you to help make your jobs better is what we'd love to know.
Yes, absolutely. So when you leave the meeting, a short survey will pop up. Please fill that out if you're able to. We value your feedback. This is a new series, the Policy Chat. We'd love to hear your ideas and thoughts for future series. And hopefully we'll get to hear from Dr. Inwood again, certainly sharing out more of this work and the exhibits and continuing to update you all on the status of the Farm Bill. All right, thank you.